memorandum titled Immediate Assessment of Aviation Safety. In light of the damage done to aviation safety by the Biden administration's DEI and woke policies, what this presidential memorandum orders is for your Secretary of Transportation and FAA administrator, in this case, acting FAA administrator, to basically ensure that we are actively undoing all of that damage, that we are assessing how much damage was done, and that we're ensuring that people hired within the FAA, in keeping with your memorandum of January 21st, are only the most outstanding, capable people for the jobs that they're being hired into.
In other words, competence.
Yes, sir. Elevating competence memorandum titled Immediate Assessment of Aviation Safety.
Date coming in right now. So apparently less than 24 hours before that American Airlines passenger jet and that military helicopter collided near Reagan International Airport, there was a near miss, like a similar incident almost happened at the same location. Let me explain. Apparently, Republic Airways Flight 4514 had to abort its landing and reroute because a helicopter was in its way as it approached the airport on Tuesday. The plane, which was inbound from Connecticut, had to dramatically increase altitude at the last second in order to avoid a collision with a helicopter that was hanging out near the airport. Thankfully, on its second approach to the runway, that plane was able to land safely. New audio from air traffic control related to that flight has now been released confirming that this occurred. This raises even more questions about the way Donald Trump has handled this entire incident, the way his Department of Defense is flying these helicopters so close to the airports, and his refusal to take any responsibility. Trump continues to try to deflect from the fact that he got rid of a key aviation board, that him and Elon Musk forced out the head of the FAA just right after his inauguration because he fined Elon Musk something like $600,000 for safety violations from SpaceX. All of his actions right now are coming under scrutiny because they clearly seem like they made our country far less safe.
Good morning and welcome to Let It Be Known. And we are so grateful to have Lauren with us again, Black Virginia News, Lauren Burke. Donald Trump has built his entire political brand on racism. And now, after this tragic plane crash, he's wasted no time blaming diversity, equity, and inclusion, or really what they're trying to say. Every time they say this, every time they say DE&I, every time they say woke or wokeness, they're saying the N-word. And it's always the fault of Black people. It's always the fault of women. Anyone who isn't a straight white male is the ones who are doing it right, are the competent ones, according to this insane racist regime that we are now under, this dictatorship. This is the same man who defended white supremacists in Charlottesville, tried to erase Black votes in the 2020 election, and gutted diversity, equity, and inclusion programs with the stroke of a pen. Now, with his MAGA allies cheering him on, he's using a national tragedy to advance a racist agenda that has nothing to do with facts and everything to do with fear mongering. And let's be clear, this isn't just about Trump. It's about the Heritage Foundation, who's really behind all of this, and an entire Republican Party willing to scapegoat people of color, women, LGBTQ communities, and even veterans to push their white nationalist vision. The CBC called it what it is, an outright lie designed to divide America. Leaders like Ayanna Pressley, Hakeem Jeffries, and even Captain Sully Sullenberger condemned these attacks by MAGA extremists. They care about power, is what they said about Trump and MAGA. Power built on hatred, deception, and exclusion. But history tells us one thing: they will ultimately lose. Yeah, you heard that right. Ultimately, every regime, Hitler's regime was ultimately overturned. Jim Crow was ultimately done away with. As the National Council on Black Affairs said, racism in the presidency is not a relic of the past. It is an evolving force. And the only way to defeat it is through resistance, because they are coming for everyone. Everyone. Lauren, that press conference was probably the worst in the history of the presidency.
Well, stay tuned because there will be many more press conferences, and I'm not sure that that's going to be the worst if he's starting out like this on day 11. This is only day 12 of the second term of Donald Trump. They're really, in a lot of ways, history is just repetitive. Things just happen again and again and again and again. And there's this group in there that really reflects the history of the United States that just feels that they should be getting what they should be getting without any real effort. And so, anytime you see competition, there's a whole big discussion happening. And what was happening in a country that is becoming browner and blacker is that there was more competition for jobs. There's more competition for money, for positions, for seats in Congress, gubernatorialships, you name it. You can see that building competition in metrics such as the record number of Congressional Black Caucus members, many of whom are representing districts that are not majority Black. You're seeing a lot of people, Black folks running for governor. You're seeing the statewide. You're seeing Angela Also Brooks. So you're seeing, even though Maryland, obviously is a 34% Black state, you're seeing more people running. You see more Black folks running, and it's women, it's Blacks, it's a lot of different demographics. And what this really reveals more than anything else is who is insecure with that, who has a problem with that, who is bothered by anything that looks more diverse than it was in the 1950s and 60s. And that is the club to which Donald Trump belongs. And that should be a surprise to absolutely nobody. He's almost 80 years old. His father was rung up by the Department of Justice for racism in housing. The world that he comes from is a world of people telling him that he's somehow superior. And if we go back to find out why he is here, it leads us back to the Correspondents' Dinner when the first Black president of the United States made a joke. And then all of a sudden, he was suddenly interested in running for president and being in that job, which he had not been previously, at least not declared, interested in. And so what drives so much of it is the Obama era is not in any way President Obama's fault, but what we see historically is a backswing anytime African Americans do take some steps ahead. It happened after the Civil War. It happens after the Great Society legislation from FDR. It happens after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. There is a backlash, and we are seeing the backlash from President Obama's time in office and the confident aura that he carried. And it's bothersome to people like Donald Trump and the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, and again, make no mistake, and that's why I wanted to make sure. And you had mentioned before we went to air, Roland talked about the Heritage Foundation too. Folks need to not forget, just like for the last couple of years, the talk of Project 2025, and some may have felt, well, we don't know that this is going to happen, or we're talking about it too much. No, you cannot talk about it enough.
Yeah,
it has to be there.
It's so funny, isn't it? I'm old enough to remember when Black leaders and Black folks that had any advocacy position whatsoever were told that they were the ones being obsessed about race and they were playing the race card. If we look at the last 12 days, I mean, this group is seriously obsessed about race. All they talk about is DEI. All they talk about is diversity. All they talk about is woke. Donald Trump was doing that on the campaign trail. He was typically vilifying Mexican immigrants coming over here. He's branding them to violence. He's branding them to rape. He's branding them to everything that's wrong in the country. That's an old thing that happened at the turn of the century in the United States. It was just different groups that were targeted. Instead of Mexican Americans, it was Irish Americans, it was Italian Americans, it was other groups. I mean, so it's a repeat of that same thing. He talks like that freely all the time. And now when they've gotten into office, they're really only, to this point, talking about the three code words for Black people, which are not really code because it's so obvious who they're talking about. They're saying woke, they're saying DEI, and they're not really saying CRT as much because CRT replaced DEI. But when they say DEI and woke, they're talking about Black people. There's this constant inference that if you are Black and hired, that you were not qualified. You were hired because you were Black, which nothing could be so much more ridiculous. The idea that if you are hired and you're Black, you could not have been better than any white candidate walking through the door. So this is all the talk of eugenics, white supremacy. It's not even prettied up. He's not even talking in code anymore. Nope. They stood up there in front of the mic yesterday, and this is the biggest irony of them all, which is why I find the Democratic Party to be completely derelict in this moment. Remember,
100%.
they're supposed to be the opposition party. And they had standing at the mic, the Republicans, Donald Trump, they had standing at the mic, J.D. Vance, okay, Sean Duffy. Okay, think about those two guys for just 1 second. And Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth had 0 qualifications to be the Secretary of Defense. No qualifications. Sean Duffy at least served in Congress, but came out of the world of reality TV. Okay, and then you have J.D. Vance, who basically just got to the Senate and now is the Vice President of the United States. So if we go through our vice presidents of recent years, Pence, Harris, Joe Biden, if you combine those 3 people, Duffy, Hegseth, and Vance, their resumes don't come close to the recent vice presidents that we've had. So they're talking about merit and merit-based and qualifications, and the people talking do not have the qualifications. And again, the Democratic Party, for the most part, is saying nothing. So I find this to be, I mean, this is very low-hanging fruit. All you have to do is reference the resumes of these people running their mouth at the podium yesterday, and you pretty much could make your point. And really not too many people are making it. So this is a strange moment, and there better be a response to it from the advocacy groups, because it gets worse from here.
Oh, and you're right. I know Hakeem Jeffries is in California, or at least as of yesterday was in California, visiting Altadena and the fire sites and things of that nature. But and the Congressional Black Caucus did put out a statement about Trump. But I just noticed their statement, and I will say this because I was very critical of them yesterday and have been very critical. Their statement did nothing to take away my criticism, because here again, they were a little tepid. I mean, Yvette Clarke was a little bit more forceful. Of course, Ayanna Pressley, and she did a podcast. She was very forceful in her words. But overall, this idea of not just targeting the ones like Trump, like Vance, they are talking about Republicans in general. They're using general terms. You have to fight fire with, people say fire with fire, you can't do it. Well, fight it with real water, fight it with real extinguishers, right? They have to be intentional. They have never been intentional, it seems. And, their constituencies get the short end of the stick all the time. Their constituents get the short end of the stick all the time.
Yeah. From November 5 to January 2025, Inauguration Day, 76 days. You had 76 days to discuss whatever strategy you may or may not have had for what you knew was coming. We knew what was going to happen in terms of how the style of this Donald Trump operates. We know what his communication style is. You saw what he did yesterday. He throws out this DEI argument with no evidence. The media picks it up. The media starts asking the Democrats, well, what about this DEI argument? I mean, this thing has no validity, but Donald Trump understands communications and he understands what he's doing. This is not about agreement. This is about what reality is. And in communication strategy, when somebody attacks on TV, you have to respond on TV. When somebody attacks on Twitter, you respond on Twitter. You notice Pete Buttigieg somehow can't find a camera yesterday after being, attacked full force by the President of the United States. He should have found a camera wherever he's located, whether it's Indiana or Michigan or wherever he is. The Congressional Black Caucus, same thing. I did notice that Leader Jeffries put out a video from California. I would ask, what are you doing in California? The fires thing, I know they have a concert that was going on. The former vice president tweeted about it. Okay, whatever. This is existential. This stuff is going to get worse. This is actually less than his second week in office. If you think this gets better, you are fooling yourself. And they have no marching orders other than to say, oh my goodness, the bodies were still in the water and he's talking. First of all, that's not news. You got to hit this guy. I'm talking rhetorically. I'm talking from a communication strategy standpoint. And I hate to criticize. These are two guys that I consider, guys that I know. In one case, I would say a friend, Mark Warner. 7:30 a.m. in the morning with 6-7 million people watching at a press conference at National Airport. And don't mention the fact that the two of them, complained about the amount of flights that were going international loudly last year. Not, oh, a letter went to somebody, loudly, that this was going to be a problem. And the business community wanted more flights international. And now we have 67 dead people. And somehow or another, that never gets mentioned until late into the afternoon or at night on MSNBC at 11 o'clock. That isn't good enough. That is not good enough. And I know everybody's trying to be respectful of the people who are dead. They should be respectful. We're looking at this young lady, Kia Duggins, from the graduated Harvard Law, and was about to be a professor at Howard. There's going to be many more of that. It's really sad to watch these videos of these kids skating. It is devastating. It is terrible. But you can say two things at the same time. You can say that this thing is sad. You can say it's devastating. It is. And you can also say that Donald Trump is hugely problematic. His decision to remove the FAA director on the 2nd is related to this, possibly. Somebody needed to say that. Of all the Democrats you saw yesterday, somebody needed to say that before noon. They have no strategy. They have no marching orders. Somebody's sending out some talking points that they're all repeating. It's not good enough. It just isn't. And I mean, I hate to be so critical because I know what it is to work in these offices. I was a communications director for a member of Congress, and I know how hard it is to do things in this communications environment. But again, this is the second time this man has been in office. You had 76 days to discuss it, and they're sitting here with nothing in terms of a strategy, a combined strategy.
And this is a guy who went out to California, Trump, with the fires, and immediately, and in front of their faces, Gavin Newsom, the mayor, Bass, blame them, blame Biden, blame Democrats. While it's going on, while people are devastated. And so there's no holds barred. It should, the Democrats, and you're right, Mike V, we are the white Democrats as well on this. It should be the same thing, because that's the only way. As you, I think part of what you mean too is you have to hit this guy the same way, the same punches he throws, you got to throw back.
Stacey,
And they refuse.
It's what your mother told you when you were a kid, when you're dealing with a bully. You
Right.
got to rhetorically punch him in the face. He is a racist. He is a white supremacist. The discussion that they are having is a white supremacist discussion. Someone has to say this. And as we talked about the other day, right, what did they do? They took two players off their playing field, one with 600,000 people on Instagram account, the other with 3 million people on Instagram account. That would be Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jasmine Crockett. They took them out of they stopped them from being in leadership positions. Well, okay, let's continue. That's the past. Let's go forward. You've got to figure out at some point to say the things that need to be said at the moment that they need to be said. And we're now 24 hours about after what has happened. You're seeing statements all over the place. You're seeing varying levels of reaction. But this is just in-your-face racism now. They've crossed the line. They've basically now dropped the pretense that we need to, say anything. At one point at the podium yesterday, Trump said something to the effect of, "They stopped white people from getting jobs." I mean, that was the essence of that sentence. They stopped white people from getting jobs, and you are the black people were blocked from, being the white people were blocked from being air traffic controllers because these black people came in. And then Vance gets up and says, well, and they're suing to get jobs. What are they talking about? These are things that you can throw haymakers at in reaction. And the response has been, in my view, a reflection of what is a deeper problem with the so-called opposition party. For a group of people that they claim to be their base, which would be black voters, I'm completely confused at what the Democrats are doing. I know that they think from their perspective that they're doing things, but you only
What are you
deal.
doing?
Yeah, you only understand that perception is reality. And this man is good at controlling the narrative. You knew that. You got to be on a crisis communications war room rapid response footing, and they're not.
The Democrats have relied on mainstream media, right? And mainstream media is is extremely afraid of Donald Trump, and we're seeing media and even, of course, social media. Facebook just gave Trump $25 million. ABC gave him $15 million. Now they are going after NPR and PBS, and you got to believe that NPR and PBS at some point is going to capitulate. They own their. This is going to be total state-run media. It's just about there anyway. But having said that, I will say this, and Trump. So Democrats depend on them to carry messages and to create messaging, because they're not creating their own message. As you said, they have no messaging to go on, and so they have failed all their constituents in a terrible way. But having said that, I will say I am extremely proud of many in that briefing room yesterday, the several anyway, who called it out. You had a couple of reporters say, well, how there's been no investigation. How could you say this is about DE&I?
Yeah, there were two reporters. I wished I knew the names. One of this is a guy from the New York, has been with the New York Times forever. It was the second guy, the white guy with the glasses, who was sitting there going, where's the proof of any of this? The first woman in the first row, the white woman, I think is ABC's correspondent. Yes, they did ask those questions, which are pretty obvious. You have to understand something, though, and this is just on a 2,000-foot level. The minute we get into the discussion and start talking in terms of DEI and qualification and who was behind the steering wheel and all that, the thing is off the rails, because Donald Trump is bringing into the discussion the notion that this all happened, that 67 people are dead because of some sort of hiring of Black people. That's just what this is. I mean, at some point, you have to take the veil off of that and ask him that. You have to say to him, and so, Mr. President, are you saying that Black people are at fault for 67 people being dead? Like, someone needs to be saying that. And so even he backed off when he got the first question of, where's your evidence? And you have to understand, too, that if the Democrats are waiting for the media, they're going to be waiting a while. This is a flood the zone strategy that you're watching. You're watching the flood the zone. The flood the zone is not new. These things are not new. Okay, this is not COVID. Oh my God, we're shocked in March of 2020 that this is happening. You knew this was going to happen. You realized yesterday they had that interesting person, Kash Patel, testifying. They had three, they actually had 2 or 3 confirmation hearings. I can't remember how many there were, right? So what does Trump do? I'm going to have a press conference at 11:30 noon, right in the middle of that. He knows that this entire information age is not built for, and these news organizations are not built for this. On top of that is the layer of who was sitting on the dais during inauguration. Bezos has business before Donald Trump. Okay, obviously Musk owns X. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg is controlling a lot of what people see on Facebook. CBS is about to capitulate and hand Donald Trump a bunch of money in a court case, a defamation case that makes absolutely no sense they win, just like ABC did. Knowing all of that, if you are the opposition party, you have to flood zones just like he's flooding zones. All the media is doing, you just have to understand, they're feeding the machine. They don't care what they feed it with, as long as it gets fed and they get their traffic. They don't care what it is. If Justin Fairfax is falsely accused of something, we'll feed it with that. If somebody says that something is racist, we'll feed it with that. So the Democrats have to understand that when your turn comes to feed that machine, you've got to feed it. So when Senator Kaine and Warner, okay, and these are not stupid guys, they've been around forever. They know what they're doing. But when that moment came of 6-7 million people watching on live TV from National Airport, you've got to say it right then at that moment. That is the moment. That is the window. Okay, there is no other window. So understanding all of that, and I know it's a lot to take in and think about, but again, you had 76 days to figure it out. Are you hearing about any big meetings by the opposition party, the Democratic Party, about any of this? Now, what is he doing? He's attacking one of your biggest base groups, African Americans, on a daily basis. He did an executive order last night declaring that because somebody Black might have been hired, but at the same time, by the way, we're finding out who the pilot of the Black Hawk was. and who
Right.
the pilot of the American Airlines jet was. And none of these would appear to be, quote, DEI hires. By the way, if they were Black, we can't buy into that logic anyway.
As I said constantly, show
Right.
me, show me, show me that a plane crash where there was a Black pilot involved. Also, show me a plane crash during the Biden administration.
Right. There wasn't one.
There
And
wasn't.
so, again, what did he do? He gets out there, he set the narrative. Once he set the narrative of we're talking about race, we're talking about affirmative action and DEI and people who are
Yeah.
unqualified getting hired, the media bought into the narrative. And that's the
Yeah.
mistake, is buying into the narrative. The Democrats, though, need to give the media content that changes that narrative. And they're failing in that round. They failed in that mission. So with all of that said, it's a return to the racism we've seen before. Black people have seen this before. You know, this is the 50s and 60s. The supremacist notion that you couldn't possibly be qualified if you were hired for a job, as if a air traffic controller just walks in and just starts controlling planes. I mean, there's a unbelievable amount of training that goes into that particular job, but it's all somebody Black's fault. They're going to keep doing this. And the Democrats are going to have to figure out what their marching orders are. And they've yet, I don't see it. Now, maybe it's there and I don't see it, but I have now talked to a lot of people. They did have a meeting, a Zoom the other day. And what I'm telling you is what they're doing is not, they may not believe it. They did win that round on Medicare. I will say this, the Medicaid round was an interesting round to watch. They effectively won that in the sense that the Trump people did back up. But this thing about racism has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with.
Yeah, and here the thing is, in Power Orange, Power 96 Orange, he is he's 100% right too. When you speak of DEI, you must tell the truth. White women benefit the most from that, and those who talk about you have to earn something by merit, if that was the case, then a lot of white males would be unemployed.
Well, if we were doing straight merit, remember, particularly in the California college system, state college system, probably wouldn't have too many. Well, I mean, they would have white men, but the dominant group would likely be the Asian applicants. If you were doing straight test scores, if you're just doing that, right? I mean, and then that's it. Okay, now, but the issue, so white males are saved by a lot of the things that you don't have to say you're just doing merit or you're just doing colorblind. I mean, I'm always laughing at it was Hegseth and Sean Duffy, this notion we're colorblind. This country has never been colorblind.
Never been colorblind. We're going to talk about that with Alphonso David shortly, but go ahead.
Good, because the country has always declared itself. They've declared who the winners were going to be from the very beginning, and that was white male landowners. The country has always written into the law with regard to Black people a bunch of exclusion, which is why you had to have the 1960s legislation. I mean, they're saying it in the law. This is not a sign in the window or anything else. So it is laughable to watch people like Pete Hegseth in particular, whose qualifications are completely lacking to be the Secretary of Defense, and who a woman filed a rape charge against to the police, a formal rape charge, stand there and lecture everybody about merit and qualification. It doesn't get more laughable than that moment, in my view, yesterday, because those three guys are actually, when you look at the resumes of vice presidents, of transportation secretaries, and transportation secretary really actually could be anybody. I mean, it really actually could. I didn't think that Pete Buttigieg had that much qualification, if I'm honest. I mean, I really didn't. He's somebody that they like in the party, and so they gave him a job. Okay.
Yep.
Secretary of Defense is a different story. That is a major department. And he has no qualifications as compared to the recent secretaries of defense. We had a 4-star general in there. So what is he talking about? So it is again, I can't, it is confusing to me to watch that level of racism have very little reaction.
Yeah, Nancy Wall had mentioned that mainstream media is afraid to say anything against Trump and what he's doing. They like, Nancy says they like when he blames Biden. He will sue them and win, which is proven to be true. And RNG mentioned earlier too. Now you see why I was very disturbed when Obama was laughing it up with Trump. And that these are images that folks remember. They remember that, and it shows you that, Lauren, I don't see how the Democratic Party ever recovers.
Oh, they can recover. I mean, they recovered from 2016's disaster. Of course, they can recover, but I'm going to say the obvious. They haven't picked a leader. They don't appear to have a leader. I think the closest they have to a leader, of course, is Leader Jeffries. But obviously, the retirement effectively of President Biden, your top person is gone, and you don't have the vice president. I don't think. I mean, I can't really speak to that because for all we know, she could come out next week and say something, right? So, but
Mhm.
they have a leadership vacuum, and they haven't picked the DNC chair. All that should have been moved the heck up, by the way. Come on, guys. I mean, what planet are you on? This guy is talking about ending departments of the government. He's talking about executive power on a level that we haven't seen or heard of in decades and decades, if at all. And you guys are just now picking a DNC chair in the first week of February. They're not meeting the moment. And if they don't realize that, then I don't know what to say anymore. I mean, I just think there's no urgency and there's no marching order and there's no plan and there's nobody that can the problem again, the party needs some sort of realignment. I mean, the people that they had that were quite good that could throw these haymakers, Andrew Cuomo, Al Franken. They had a guy
Mhm.
named Alan Grayson who was a member of Congress in Florida that really could throw a haymaker. Cuomo, the liberal left, feminist left, decided that they wanted to destroy Andrew Cuomo. I mean, what am I supposed to say? I mean, the liberal left in
Mm.
New York didn't like Andrew Cuomo. Al Franken
Who is
was
coming back?
who is
Who is
coming
making a
back.
comeback? Yeah,
You're right about that, and likely will be the mayor of New York if I had to predict
yeah.
it right now. Al Franken was just craziness. I mean, I'm not.
The
We're not going
Al
to put
Franken thing, yeah. Listen, we could talk all we want about all the other allegations and
right,
stuff like that, but one
right.
of the most ridiculous will always be the
Yeah,
Franklin.
it was absolute craziness. And understand something, Al Franken was one of the best questioners on the Democratic side in the U.S. Senate that they had at the time. Because being a comedian, he had that comedic timing. He's extremely smart. There was some elements to that really worked well for him, and he was throwing a punch, and the Democratic Party dismantled him, not the Republic. I mean, I shouldn't say. I mean, Jane Mayer's great piece in the New Yorker. You should read that. There is a trigger at the beginning of that story from a Republican operative, but it was really the Democrats that destroyed Al Franken, just like with the Justin Fairfax situation. So. What are they thinking? You need these players on the field. This is like a game of chess, and you just took off your queen and
Well,
your
and
you
A-
know.
and it runs to the Nina Turners, our guy in New York. You know who I'm talking about, the black congressman who pulled the fire alarm,
Oh,
um,
yeah, Bowman. So
Bowman, Jamal
Corey,
Bowman,
yeah, Corey Bush,
Corey
Bowman,
Bush. Yeah, those who have backbone.
those
Th-
who will say the thing that needs to be said, right?
Right,
In an
right.
argument, right? Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a thing going on, a push pull between the money and those types of progressive members that I think the leadership of the party, frankly, doesn't care for. There's a push pull with regard to policy in the Middle East, and Nina Turner and Bowman and Bush find themselves on the wrong side of the Democratic Party and APAC on that. So there's a whole push pull on that. But when it comes to messaging strategy and aggressiveness levels, yes, that is the tenor. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the type of person that you need to have against a Donald Trump. You have to match him, and they're not matching him. And I don't at this point, I don't know why. This is not 2017. You're not no, you're not just figuring out that wait a minute, this guy's flooding the zone. You know what the strategy is, and you're failing. So I'm confused about that.
Yeah, and Donald Trump in a nutshell, Southbound 3000 mentions, when asked about visiting the crash site, Donald Trump's response, "What you want me to do? Go swimming?" I mean, that is it is one of the if we started a list of the most unpresidential statements, there's not enough paper in the world to fill the list. And that certainly has to go right up there toward the top of it when he said that yesterday.
That well, you remember at the very beginning in July of the Harris presidential campaign, I don't know who that person was out there who was the press secretary, who was writing, who was actually putting out the statements, but there was somebody in there, and I sense a Gen Y individual that was stating what the responses were in a way that I thought was a very interesting counter to President Trump. Very blunt, a very just the left's position just turned around. So basically doing exactly what Trump was doing from a left political standpoint. Wherever that person is, I'm pretty sure that the Democrats might want to discuss communication strategy with that individual, because I think it was probably a group of younger staffers, if I had to guess. There's just a certain style of communication strategy in this political age. But again, with this level of racism out there, you'll notice too in this, and it is amazing to me. There's no women in these pictures. That press conference yesterday. There's no women. He
Right.
doesn't have any women around. I mean, usually people who are racist and do racist tropes are not in love with women. Like that's typically those things follow. It's like anti-Semitism and racism. Usually, if you're a racist, you're an anti-Semite, and vice versa. Like there's certain things that just follow. And if you notice, you don't see any women around either. So there's that.
Yeah, it's true. It is true. And some tough words about Democrats from Aquarius Goddess, who says Democrats are acting like peas, and we can only surmise what the P word is there. And Nagon 11 says these are facts. They quote, they've got to match this animal.
Well, you see, it's funny that the word animal comes up, not something I typically use to
Right.
refer to other human beings, but there is something about him that is just kind of pathological in terms of he is there for the kill. Like he's in for the kill. He has no empathy. He's kind of like what they tell you when you go to the zoo, not to stand near the gate, like not to stand near because
Lauren is cooking, y'all. Let me listen.
yeah, I
Let me
mean,
sit back.
the lions and the tigers are what they are. They understand predatory behavior and survival. And Donald Trump just kind of has this. He has a way of doing business that has no empathy. I mean, the fact that he didn't even mention you have 67 people dead in the Potomac River, less than 2 miles from the White House, and he didn't even mention that. Doesn't even mention it because he's going in for, I'm going to embarrass you people. I'm going to control this narrative. He knows exactly what he was doing. If you notice, Duffy and Vance and Hegseth said the exact same words. They're in the back going over the talking points. They're coming out and they're repeating. They have marching orders. And so Trump doesn't care about anything other than controlling that cycle of news. We effectively have no news cycle anymore because everything is a news cycle. But he understands how to control a conversation. And I'm telling you, we will see this again and again for the next 1,000 days.
Yeah, Dr. Nicole says, I am waiting to hear the credentials of all involved, pilots, air traffic controllers, etc., regardless of race, to show their qualifications for the positions they're in. That is how you prove that DE&I plays no role. Most likely, it may be more likely due to lack of adequate staffing numbers and pay. In any case, Trump still can't make those accusations without any documentation or proof. It's reckless and pandering to their racist base. 100%.
Yeah, I
100.
don't know that. I really think that one of the things about communication strategy is that, you got to be on offense. You are on defense when you're reacting to whatever it is that somebody's trying to get you to react to. The way he plays is to keep everybody on defense all the time by saying something shocking and trying to get you to react. If you notice, he said an expletive yesterday from the podium,
Yeah.
which was to me just built in to get everyone. We're reacting now. Everybody's reacting. The media's reacting. The Democrats are reacting. Someone is writing us right now saying that they have to, what they should do is prove their credentials. They don't have to prove their credentials. Nobody has to prove their credentials to Donald Trump. If you can fly an airplane or you're an air traffic controller, this isn't some moment where you got to prove your credentials. That's what he wants you to do. He wants to drive your insecurity and make you do stuff and make you run around. And you gotta get a hold of the fact that that controlling of the narrative is what is breaking everybody, because everybody's in response to him instead of creating the offensive strategy. It's just like in football. When your offense has the ball, obviously the defense has to be running backwards. The safeties in the corners are running backwards in defense. That is what is going on here. He understands it. Again, I grew up in New York. My mother's from Virginia, but I grew up in New York. I watched Donald Trump when I was a teenager, when I was in junior high school. He did it on a lower level then, but he did the same thing. Now you're on a higher and more loud level, but this guy understands communications on a deep level.
Yeah, yeah. Two quick questions before we have to move on to our discussion with Alphonso David. Lauren, two questions for you real quick. Danielle Pierre says the Democrats seem to be compromised. Are they compromised?
Well, racially, they're always compromised. I think you have white Democrats who, quite frankly, want to embrace part of the president's agenda. I mean, look at Fetterman, for example. Look at these Democrats who are voting for these nominees. So that level of compromise is correct. Almost everybody in our political system is compromised by money in different ways.
Yeah, and finally, Lauren, are you ready to? Is it time to declare? Or do you feel like it's time to declare Trump the most racist president we've had?
Probably. I'm a history major. I graduated in history at American University, despite my Virginia Tech hat. I just wear a lot of red and like this hat. So I would say you'd have to study a little bit on Woodrow Wilson and some of these other presidents, because the level of racism, remember, Birth of a Nation played in the White House during Woodrow Wilson. The difference is our media age and our technological age is structured differently. It's hard to compare because the level of amplification now is so fast and so loud on anything a president says. And that is making money for people. It's hard to answer that question. I suspect that he probably is, but there are some presidents out there that have to be carefully considered.
And lastly, I forgot. I knew I would forget, so I should have said it earlier. Tell us about the podcast you have coming up.
Yeah, well, I have Black Virginia News, which I own, and covers the Black community and Black politics in Virginia. And there's a podcast attached to that called Black Virginia News on all your podcast platforms. And there will be an episode coming out today on brazen race, the return of brazen race. This is probably the most brazen racism we've seen from anybody in politics. I mean, we could put Jesse Helms out there. We could put Lester Maddox out there, George Wallace. And this is on another level. I mean, Richard Nixon, everybody said that he used the N-word in the White House. We found that out on tapes. We wasn't at the podium in the White House briefing room saying stuff. So it's an interesting thing to think about. You know?
So check out Lauren, first the podcast for sure, but also subscribe to Black Virginia News as well. You don't want to miss the news coming out of there, because again, as she mentioned earlier, and we wrote about it too, that Democrats in Virginia have warned about the chaotic situation and the worsening situation at Reagan National Airport in DC long before this happened. So lots of good stuff. Go ahead.
There was a close call last year. There was a close call, just like the one Greer played at the beginning of the show, and it spurred all this discussion. So yeah, you're right. And they talked about it loudly. I mean, letters went in and there were press conferences and nobody said anything. So here we are.
Yeah. So check out Black Virginia News. Now, the president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum, Alphonso David, talked to us about the fight for freedom and fairness under law cannot be colorblind. Let's go to that discussion. As the Trump administration prepares to take office, continue to take action in office, we should say, the fight for freedom and fairness under the law is at risk of being redefined in the most dangerous of ways. Efforts to dismantle the principle of disparate impact, an essential tool for addressing systemic racism, threaten to cement policies that claim to be colorblind, but they actually perpetuate inequities. Without this legal safeguard, policies that harm Black communities will remain unchallenged if Trump has his way, and it will only deepen the disparities that systemic racism creates in housing, education, healthcare, and employment. Joining us today is Alphonso David, the president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum, whose work is at the forefront of the fight to ensure freedom and fairness under the law. Alphonso, welcome to Let It Be Known News.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Alphonso, the theme of freedom and fairness under the law cannot be colorblind. It challenges the narrative that ignoring race will fix systemic issues. Can you explain why a colorblind approach actively perpetuates inequality?
Well, I think approaching life through a colorblind lens ignores the reality. I think we would all love to live in a space that is colorblind, but unfortunately, history has shown us that we still live in spaces, we still work in spaces, we still operate in spaces that are not colorblind. We only have to look at the data to show us that, unfortunately, race and ethnicity have been used as a basis for discrimination and for indifference. So we look at corporate America as an example, and you look at the number of people who are running Fortune 500 companies, they're largely white men. There are only 2 Black women that are running Fortune 500 companies in this country, and there are thousands of them. That is a huge problem, because what you're signaling or communicating to people of color and Black people specifically is that we either are not smart or we're not qualified to run Fortune 500 companies. That simply is not true. It is the same when we look at the legal profession. It is the same when we look at intellectual or communications, or you just pick the industry. We have significant disparities where Black and brown people do not have the opportunities that others have. And that's why you have diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We have allowed the far right to mischaracterize what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. Diversity, equity, and inclusion was a response to the civil rights laws. For folks who may not know, the civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s, and when they were passed, large companies and institutions implemented these programs called diversity, equity, and inclusion, in part because they wanted to make sure they complied with the civil rights laws. Diversity, equity, and inclusion gives them an opportunity to test their systems, to test their institutions, to make sure that they were breaking down systemic barriers that existed. It doesn't perpetuate discrimination. It actually addresses bias and addresses discrimination. So when folks say, oh, it'll be great to live in a colorblind society, I say that's great. That's what we want as well. The only problem is we have evidence, and we have years and years of evidence that shows that people of color are being denied opportunities despite the fact that they're qualified. And if someone were to say, well, give me an example, look at the recent Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. She graduated from an Ivy League school. She is certainly more than well qualified, and yet folks were calling her a DEI hire. That is the point, that we are allowing the far right to sort of redefine and recharacterize what diversity is and how it actually advances our culture, how it actually leads to greater innovation, and how it actually leads to higher revenues for companies.
Yeah, and 1 week into office, we've already seen the all out. We've been seeing it before. Let's face it, we've seen the conservatives move this way for some time, but now in 1 week into office, we've seen the administrative actions or executive actions, if you will, of the president, including among the most recent stopping funding to states and municipalities. And in that memo, it mentions this whole idea of wokeness. We want to make sure that it's not going to anything that's so-called woke or DE&I. So the assault, Alphonso, it continues, but it's not only continues, but it's been heightened. And so we have arguments even in court about the disparate impact, which is critical in holding systems accountable for policies that marginalize us. But what are the implications as the courts, or if the courts reject this principle? And on that note, how can we fight back?
Well, I think what we're seeing is, as you mentioned before, a full-scale assault on civil rights. And let's all remember why we have civil rights, right? Because for decades, Black and brown people were treated as less than under the law, right? Go as far back as Dred Scott, where the US Supreme Court concluded that I, as a Black man, or you as a Black man, were not considered full citizens under the Constitution. So we've had the US Supreme Court and the legislature and the White House in prior administrations indoctrinate discrimination into our systems, into our institutions. And now what we have is a president that's challenging all of the efforts, all of the progress that we've made to address systemic discrimination and bias in our systems. So when we look at where we are now and where we could be in the next few months or the next few years, we have to continue fighting to make sure that we protect what our ancestors fought for, what Dr. Martin Luther King fought for, what Malcolm X fought for, what Henry Lou Famer fought for. We have to make sure that we're protecting these wins, these gains, because they've helped us get a little bit closer to realizing the full promise of this country, which is freedom and equality for all. But we don't have that today. So yes, we will be challenging these executive orders and executive actions that are looking to roll back our protections. And we will be fighting in the courts, and we will be fighting in the court of public opinion, because this is not only about filing a lawsuit, right? That's obviously important, but it's also about making sure that we fight against the narrative that diversity, equity, and inclusion lowers the standards. It doesn't. Diversity, equity, and inclusion actually gets to the core issue. It gets to addressing systemic discrimination and bias. And that is why it exists. It doesn't lower the standards. It actually roots out bias and discrimination. And so the narrative is incredibly important, because we have, unfortunately, in some circles, allowed the far right to classify everything as DEI. Yeah. Right? If a company decides to give money to a population, it's being classified as DEI, and that's not what it is.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the courts, and to many, and obviously we have to use the courts to the best of our ability when it comes to these situations. But we also have to face the reality that we're talking about, particularly when it comes to the administration and fighting the administration. We're talking about federal courts, and we know that. Look, I'll say it, even if you might not be able to say it. The Supreme Court is owned by Donald Trump, right? So folks like that who look like us are wondering, what do we do? How can we mount a successful fight here? Are we just swinging at the wind when we're going into court? Because it's going to be federal court, and he basically has control. I mean, there are some liberal judges. There are some judges out there who, even if they're not considered liberal, who might, is a couple that might do the right thing. But you're going on that, and the fact that this guy is going to take it, his administration is going to take everything up to his friends at the Supreme Court. So what do we do? Give us a blueprint if you can.
Well, I can't give you a blueprint, because that will be outlining our strategy. But what I can say is
okay, this. I appreciate that.
What I can say is this: let's remember our history, right? Let's remember Thurgood Marshall. Let's remember the titans, the legal titans, and the strategists of the past. We didn't always have the courts. They fought strategically to advance legal arguments that ultimately were successful. We will do the same thing here. There's an old saying, there are a variety of ways to skin a cat. And we should just be mindful of the reality that we have some brilliant lawyers and some brilliant strategists on our side. And yes, there are many districts around the country and circuits around the country that may be hostile to our arguments, but there are others that may not be. There are others that are actually looking at the Constitution and the federal laws through an objective lens. So we have to continue fighting. We will not give up because, well, by giving up, we are actually rejecting or not honoring, I should say, the legacy of our ancestors. So let's not be so dismayed about the current composition of the US Supreme Court, because we also have to remember that in some cases, what we're fighting for benefits everyone. And so as we think about how we frame our legal arguments, as we think about which courts we're going to be fighting in, we're going to be very strategic. And there are many people in this space, many advocates who have been doing this work for a long time that are thinking just like I am about where to file, how to file, who to file against, and when to do it. And so we will be developing and refining our approaches over time, but just know that we're currently working on challenging a lot of these orders and actions that we think are blatantly unconstitutional, as well as deeply problematic culturally. I'll leave you with this on this point. Donald Trump issued an executive order essentially attempting to end birthright citizenship, right? So historically, and it's in our Constitution, if you are born in this country, by nature of being born here, you are considered a US citizen. It is in the 14th Amendment. Donald Trump issues an executive order essentially looking to end that practice and that policy. And a federal judge just recently issued, only a few days ago, an order essentially saying, no, you cannot do that. You cannot end birthright citizenship because it is, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. That is a federal district court judge. So let's put this in perspective. We will continue to fight, and we will continue to fight strategically to make sure that we protect our rights.
Yeah, and we definitely with you on that, as far as not suggesting anyone just lay down and give up. Your work with the Global Black Economic Forum focuses on creating opportunities for Black communities. How do you balance addressing systemic racism with building pathways, especially today under this oppressive administration? How do you balance addressing systemic racism with building pathways for economic success?
We do both. And we, as you said, we have to balance the scales. In every single environment, there are opportunities. And we have to identify those opportunities and communicate them to our community. And so we're working on identifying the new and emerging opportunities that exist for our community to succeed at every single social status. And they do exist. In addition to that, we are fighting to make sure that we are protecting our rights in the courts, in the court of public opinion, in state legislatures, as well as in Congress. So we are doing all of that work. And as you said, it is a balance, because we're not just simply fighting to protect our rights. We also have to identify the opportunities that exist, not only here in the United States, but the opportunities that exist globally for us to expand economic opportunity for Black people and for people of color generally.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something that I think is not, as a whole, I think our community doesn't, as a whole, consider enough. And that is the fact that there are Black folks in London, there are Black folks in Germany, there are Black folks everywhere. There's a whole world out there. So I think what you just said is very, very important. Alphonso, you also have worked extensively with business leaders and entrepreneurs. What responsibility? We see these, there are a handful of organizations like Costco and others who have said, Ben and Jerry's, we are still sticking with our DE&I initiatives. What responsibility do corporate America, businesses have in pushing back against systemic inequalities, and how can they lead by example?
Well, companies not only have a legal obligation, but they have a cultural one as well. What I mean by that is when the civil rights laws were passed, all companies were, well, the majority of companies, I should say, were bound by those rules and those regulations, and they still are. So you can't look the other way when you see bias and discrimination. You have to actually address it. And if you don't, you open yourself up to liability. So those corporations still have an affirmative obligation to address discrimination and bias. But also culturally, those corporations have to recognize that their consumers are directly responsible for their success. So their consumers include us. Their consumers include Black and brown people. Their consumers include women. And if those corporations are not respecting and valuing their consumers will go somewhere else, right? We're seeing their campaigns right now to support Costco, because Costco actually rejected multiple attempts to eradicate or, essentially dilute their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. But then you have other companies like Meta that has tried to mischaracterize the law and suggest that the US Supreme Court's decision in affirmative action in some ways affected or influenced their decision. The affirmative action decision that was issued by the US Supreme Court has nothing to do with businesses. It is limited to education. It is limited to college admissions policies. It does not in any way apply to employment, doesn't apply to fellowship programs. It doesn't apply to scholarship programs within the private sector. It only applies to education policies as it relates to companies or educational institutions, that are receiving federal funding. But what Meta is suggesting is that that decision in some ways influences their determination as to whether or not to continue their programming, and that's just false. So as we think about where we should be utilizing our power, think about how you spend your money. Think about which products and services you're purchasing, and try to the extent possible, only support those who support you. And that is, I think, how we can take back our power in this moment.
Yeah, which is, as you mentioned, the Costco situation. At the same time, you have Target, and we saw Tabitha Brown say, hey, you still should support the Black owned products in Target. It becomes sort of a challenge. Doesn't that become a challenge? And how do we overcome that challenge? Your thoughts on that particular situation?
Look, I do think it's a challenge. We want to continue supporting Black and brown businesses, and at the same time, we want to make sure we're not supporting large corporations that don't support us. I think there are a variety of ways to do that. If you are supporting a product or a company, a Black-owned company, in many cases, you can purchase that product from more than one source. So think about where you're purchasing that. Maybe you've always purchased it from Target. Maybe you should investigate, is there another place you can purchase that product and still support that Black business? Because those Black businesses now have to reevaluate, and this is a personal decision for them, obviously, but they have to reevaluate whether they want to continue selling in those stores that don't support people of color. And in some instances, they may say, I don't have a choice. My revenue margin is too low. I am selling in this store and I cannot afford to stop selling in this store because I may go out of business. They have some real decisions to make over the next few weeks and months. And I think we have to recognize the challenges that they're confronting. But when we make our individual decisions, I think one of the things we can do is look to see, are there other places to purchase this product where we're maintaining our own integrity by not supporting a company that is not supporting us?
Yeah, great point. Before we let you go, you gotta ask you, we gotta talk a little bit about the Fearless Fund, which represents a powerful example of supporting Black women entrepreneurs. How does investing, again, underscore for our viewers and listeners, how does investing in such initiatives contribute to dismantling systemic barriers?
So for folks who may not know, if you start your own business and you're looking to scale it, many people look for investors. And this is a concept called venture capitalism, where you go out and you propose, you do pitches, if you will, to get people to invest in your company. And if they invest in your company, in some ways, you may give them a piece of equity, a 1% of your company, 5%, whatever the investment is. That construct that we currently have in this country, there's about $288 billion that's allocated through the venture capital space every single year. And of the 288 billion, less than 1% goes to Black people. So as you're thinking about, if you have marketable, if you have excess resources, if you are investing generally in the market, think about who you're investing with. There are many Black and brown businesses that are looking for people to invest in their companies. If you don't know, I'll give you one example. Arian Simone is running Fearless Fund. If you want to invest in her company, that may be a good investment for you. Melissa Bradley, who has been doing this work for a very long time and is working with other entrepreneurs all over the country, invest in her company as she's trying to help other companies grow. There are ways that we can empower our community. There are ways that we can address systemic bias and discrimination outside of the existing paradigm, and that is one way that you could do it.
I think that's that's a great thing, and we'll lean upon you among others to help us put together a nice strong list, green book, if you will, on where to buy Black and keep it, keep the funds going there, because that's probably going to go a long way in helping the cause that we're talking about today all together, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have to invest in ourselves. We have to invest in our communities, especially now where people are intentionally denying the inequality and inequities that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alphonso, real quick, what gives you hope that freedom and fairness can still prevail?
I take sometimes my energy from the past. I think about our ancestors and what they went through and what they died for. By most standards, I would say any objective standard, the quality of life that we have now is better than what it was back then, where we were considered officially pieces of property. I'm not suggesting we've gotten there. I'm not suggesting we've achieved fairness, equity, or equality. But what I am saying is that let's think back to all of the sacrifices our ancestors made to get us to this point where we can pull from their reserves to get us to the next point. And that for me is where I get some of my inspiration, whether it be from Fannie Lou Hamer or James Baldwin or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. They spoke about the challenges that they were facing, and they got up every single day to continue the fight. And I think we need to do the same.
And finally, in addition to that, there is, as to quote Dr. King, some difficult times ahead. But what message do you want to leave with those fighting for equity?
I want us to make sure that we tap into our resilience. We are a resilient group of people. We have been beaten down for decades and we're still here. And so tap into that resilience. Yes, you can take a break, but don't quit.
Yeah. Too legit to quit. Alphonso David, the president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum. We thank you so much for sharing some vital information here with Let It Be Known. Absolutely. That was Alphonso David, and I noticed some of the comments that was pre-recorded. Otherwise, I would have asked your questions there. But as always, great questions that you guys ask as well. We appreciate you. Lots going on. Before we go, just a couple of news items right quick. In fact, we will be covering this. There's a Republican congressman who suggests removing child labor laws and having elementary school kids work at fast food chains instead of providing free school meals. This is all about the dictatorship, right? And another news, Trump has signed an executive order to make international students involved in pro-Palestine protests eligible for deportation. So again, as Lauren Burke and others have discussed, and Lauren, of course, discussed it more in depth this morning. This is in your face now. It's in your face. So, folks, information is power. and we will continue to try and bring you as much information we deem necessary. We don't want to, what we've been trying to do, and I know we haven't been totally successful, is getting away from a lot of Trump stuff. But it's hard to do when it directly affects you. And so those are the things that we're going to continue to bring you, things that directly affect you, Black folks in particular. So keep tuned to Let It Be Known, and we thank you all for your support. Don't forget to watch the RNG Swag Sports tonight on YouTube. I'm sure he's going to teach us some more about college football and other things. Until then, we will see you on Monday. Thanks for watching.